What if the most terrifying mystery wasn't a missing persons case, but the impossible return? Imagine 3 children, gone without a single clue or scream, vanished in a thin air from a sunny park in front of their families. For 7 long years, there were no answers, only grief and silence. Then, on the exact same day they disappear, they are found. Not a day older. Not a single memory of time passed. They simply came back. Where were they? What happened in those 7 lost years? And why does their return feel more like the beginning of a nightmare than the end of one? The truth is more unsettling than anything you could imagine. If this story sent a chill down your spine, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. We dive deep into the world's most baffling unsolved mysteries, and your support helps us bring these stories to light. Now, I have a question for you. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know your city name in the comments below. The sun was a lazy gold coin in the vast blue sky over Clearwater Park, a perfect disk of warmth on that Saturday, the 18th of May. It was the kind of day memories are built on, the air smelling of cut grass and charcoal from the public grills. For the Miller and Vance families, it was a much-needed respite. Mark and Sarah Miller watched their 2 children, 8-year-old Leo and his 6-year-old sister, Chloe, race across the wide expanse of green with their best friend, 10-year-old Emily Vance. Emily's father, David Vance, flipped burgers on a smoky grill, laughing at something Mark said. His wife, Helen, was laying out a checkered blanket, smoothing the corners against a gentle breeze. The scene was a photograph of ordinary happiness, a moment so simple and common that no one present could have possibly imagined it would become the central, horrifying mystery of their lives. The picnic spot was chosen for its open sight lines. The parents could see the children perfectly as they played a rambunctious game of tag near the edge of the tree line, about 50 yards away. The woods behind them were part of the park, well-trodden and familiar, not a deep or forbidding forest. At 2:17 p.m., according to the timestamp on the last photo Sarah Miller took, the 3 children were a blur of joyful motion. Chloe red sundress, a bright poppy against the green. Mark Miller called out to them, "Hey guys, food's almost ready." Leo turned and waved, his shout of "Okay, Dad," just audible over the laughter of other families and the distant shrieks from the playground. David Vance placed the last perfectly grilled burger onto a plate. Helen began pouring cups of lemonade. It was a synchronized dance, a family routine. Sarah stood up, brushing grass from her knees, and squinted towards the tree line. "I'll go round them up," she said, her voice light. She took a dozen steps towards the children before pausing to let cyclists pass. The interruption lasted 3, maybe 4 seconds. When she looked up again, the field where the children had been playing was empty. Her first thought was that they had ducked into the trees, perhaps chasing a ball or playing a trick. "Now, Chloe, Emily, lunchtime," she called, her voice carrying easily across the quiet field. There was no response. Not a giggle, not a rustle. A coldness, completely alien to the warm day, touched the base of her spine. Mark and David, noticing her still stance, walked over. "What's up?" Mark asked, his smile fading as he saw her face. "They were right there," Sarah said, pointing a finger that had begun to tremble. "Right there." I looked away for a second. David Vance, ever practical, cupped his hand around his mouth. "Emily, kids, this isn't funny." His booming voice should have flushed them out immediately. It should have been met with giggles and a dramatic reveal. Instead, the silence that answered was thick and absolute. The 3 adults exchanged a glance where amusement swiftly curdled into concern. They fanned out, walking quickly towards the trees, calling the children's names with increasing urgency. Their search was methodical at first, checking behind wide oak trunks and thick bushes, their voices tight with the effort to sound calm. "All right, very funny, you got us. Now come out." But the jokes stopped after 2 minutes. The concern bloomed into a hot, sharp panic after 5. The children were gone. Helen Vance had joined them, her face pale. Other picnickers, alerted by the frantic calls, began to look around their own blankets and tables. A man on a nearby bench said he'd seen the 3 kids running towards the trees, but he'd looked down at his newspaper and hadn't seen them come out. He assumed they'd just gone into play. No one else had seen a thing. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed them whole. The first police car arrived at 2:48 p.m. The description given was baffling. 3 children vanished from an open field in broad daylight, under the direct but momentarily averted gaze of their parents. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, no unfamiliar vehicles speeding away. The initial theory was that they had simply wandered off and gotten lost in the woods, a notion that was comforting in its simplicity. A massive search party was organized within the hour. Dozens of volunteers and police officers with dogs scoured every inch of the woodland. The dogs picked up the children's scent immediately, leading it right to the spot where they had last been seen. And there it simply stopped. It didn't trail off into the woods. It vanished, as if the children had been lifted straight up into the air. The investigation exploded in scope. The park was sealed off. Detectives canvassed every home in the surrounding area. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras crisscrossed the sky. Dive teams dragged the small lake at the park center. The media descended, and the story of the Clearwater vanishing became a national obsession. Yet, day after day, the result was the same: nothing. There were no ransom notes, no credible sightings, no whispers in the criminal underworld. The parents were investigated, their lives turned inside out, but their alibis were each other, and their grief was palpably, horrifyingly real. Theories flourished like poisonous mushrooms. There was talk of a secret underground tunnel system, though none was ever found. A woman claimed she'd seen a bright, silent light in the sky that afternoon, fueling rumors of alien abduction. Others whispered of a dimension slip, a temporary rift in the fabric of reality. The police, bound by evidence and forensics, had no answers. The case grew cold, a permanent, open wound for the families and the town. The picnics at Clearwater Park stopped. The laughter there seemed to die, the entire place forever stained by the mystery of that one perfect afternoon. The Millers and the Van Cess moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders. Their lives became a haunted waiting, a 7-year-long exhale held in the dark, with no hope of any answer ever coming. The world eventually moved on, but on the 7th anniversary of the disappearance, the impossible happened. The phone rang. The 7th anniversary of the disappearance arrived under a sky of pale, washed-out blue. For the families, it was a day marked on the calendar with a silent, heavy dread, a day to be endured rather than commemorated. The public vigils had long since ended. The flood of media calls had dried up to a trickle and then to nothing. The world attention had moved on to fresher tragedies. But for Mark and Sarah Miller and for David and Helen Vance, the passage of time was a strange and cruel illusion. While 7 years of calendars had been torn away, their internal clocks remained frozen at 2:17 p.m. on that Saturday in May, trapped in the endless loop of those final, ordinary seconds before their world ended. They had moved to different towns, tried to build different lives, but their houses were filled with the silence of missing laughter, their lives defined by a single, unanswered question. Clearwater Park itself had undergone a transformation, a deliberate effort by the town to shed its association with the tragedy. The old, weathered playground equipment was torn out and replaced with bright, modern structures in primary colors. The grove of trees where the children had last been seen was thinned, and a smooth, paved walking path now wound through it, an attempt to impose order and normalcy on a place haunted by chaos and mystery. The town wanted to remember, but it also wanted to forget. On that afternoon, the park was peaceful, with a few families scattered across the new lawns, their voices soft in the warm air. The lingering superstition about the place meant few ventured far from the open fields, and the new path by the tree line was often quiet. It was on this path that Park Ranger Ben Carter was making his afternoon rounds. He was a newcomer, having only lived in town for a few years, and the history of the park was just a ghost story to him, a piece of dark local folklore he'd heard mentioned in hushed tones. His job was to check the trash cans, ensure the gates were secure, and offer directions to visitors. It was mundane, quiet work. As he walked the new path, he noticed a small group sitting on one of the benches donated by the town's Rotary Club. His first assumption was that they were teenagers skipping school, but something about them was immediately off. There were 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl, and they were unnaturally still. They were dressed in summer clothes, a red sundress on the youngest girl, a bright blue t-shirt on the older boy that looked strangely dated and slightly faded, as if they'd been kept in an attic for a long time. "Afternoon," Ben said, his voice friendly and routine. "Everything all right over here?" The 3 figures turned to look at him. Their faces were pale, their expressions blank with a deep, unsettling confusion. They didn't look like troublemakers. They looked lost in a way he had never seen before. The oldest, a girl, had her arms wrapped around herself. The boy next to her had a protective arm around the smallest girl, who was clutching a faded stuffed rabbit. The toy looked old and well-loved, its fur matted. "Are you kids lost?" Ben asked, slowing his approach. He kept his tone light, non-threatening. The oldest girl spoke, her voice a dry, hesitant whisper. "We can't find our parents." The simple sentence was delivered not with a child's whine, but with a hollow, disoriented fear that seemed to come from a very deep place. "Okay, well, we can fix that," Ben said reassuringly, pulling out his small notepad. "Let's get you to the ranger station, and we'll give them a call. They're probably looking for you right now. What are your names?" The boy, his chin trembling just slightly, spoke up. "I'm Leo. This is my sister, Chloe. And that's Emily." He pointed to the older girl. The name sparked a distant, uncomfortable echo in Ben's memory. Leo, Chloe, Emily. He'd heard those names before in that sad story about the park. He pushed the thought aside. It was a coincidence. These were just some lost kids with common names. "All right, Leo, Chloe, Emily. I'm Ranger Ben. Let's get you sorted out." He reached for his radio, ready to call on a found child report. It was the little girl, Chloe, who spoke next. She pointed a small, thin finger toward the wide, empty field where families now played frisbee. "We were playing tag over there. My dad said the food was almost ready." She said it with the simple, factual clarity of a child, completely unaware of the seismic shock her words delivered. Ben's hand froze an inch from his radio. The air around him seemed to grow still and heavy. He looked from her face to the field and back again. The story, the details he'd heard in the bar, the ones everyone knew. The game of tag, the call for lunch, the red sundress. His eyes locked on the stuffed rabbit in her arms, and a specific, chilling detail from the old news reports surfaced in his mind. Witnesses said the youngest Miller girl was last seen carrying a white stuffed rabbit. A cold, impossible dread seized him. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. These children weren't just lost. They were from another time. Their clothes weren't old-fashioned. They were 7 years out of date. Their confusion wasn't from wandering off. It was from a gap in existence they couldn't comprehend. He fumbled for his radio, his fingers suddenly numb and clumsy. His voice, when he finally spoke, was tight and strained, stripped of all its professional calm. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7 at Clearwater Park. I have a code amber at my location on the East Perimeter path. I need immediate backup and medical personnel. And dispatch, you need to pull the case file for the Miller Vance disappearance. Right now." He couldn't tear his eyes away from them. They stared back, 3 children who had just stepped out of nightmare and into a sunny afternoon, waiting for a lunch that was 7 years cold. The radio crackled to life back at the dispatch center, and for a moment, there was only stunned silence. The dispatcher, a veteran named Maureen who had lived through the original tragedy, felt the blood drain from her face. She had taken the first frantic calls 7 years ago. She knew the names Leo, Chloe, and Emily as well as she knew her own children's. Her voice, when she finally responded, was a mixture of professional duty and sheer disbelief. "Unit 7, confirm your last transmission. Did you say Miller Vance disappearance?" Ben Carter couldn't tear his eyes away from the 3 children on the bench. "Affirmative, dispatch. I have 3 juveniles here matching the description. They state those are their names." He kept his voice low, trying not to frighten them further. but the tremor was unmistakable. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, the quiet of Clearwater Park was shattered by the approaching wail of sirens, growing from a faint echo to a deafening chorus. The first police cruiser skidded to a halt on the new path, its lights painting the trees in frantic pulses of blue and red. Two officers emerged, their hands on their sidearms, their faces etched with a confusion that mirrored Ben's own. They saw not dangerous criminals, but three small, terrified children huddled together on a park bench, looking like refugees from another time. The scene was surreal. The children flinched at the blaring sirens and the sudden arrival of loud, uniformed strangers. Chloe began to cry, quiet, scared sobs into her brother's shirt. Leo held her tighter, his own young face a mask of brave confusion. Emily just stared, her eyes wide and unblinking, taking in the strange cars and the anxious adults. The officers, their training manuals having no protocol for this, slowly holstered their weapons and approached with cautious, gentle words. "It's okay, kids. We're here to help. Everything is going to be okay." The words fell hollow, even to them. How could anything ever be okay again after this? An ambulance arrived, and two paramedics, a man and a woman, stepped out with a stretcher. Their professional calm was a stark contrast to the electric tension buzzing among the police. They knelt before the children, speaking in soft, soothing tones. "Hi there, I'm Jenny. This is Tom. We're just going to make sure you're all feeling all right. Okay? Can you tell me if anything hurts?" The children shook their heads silently. Physically, they appeared perfectly healthy, if a little pale and dehydrated. But their eyes held a vacant, faraway look that was deeply unsettling. They were compliant but distant, as if they were only half present. The decision was made to take them to Clearwater Memorial Hospital for a full evaluation. The news, however, could not be contained. It leaked from the dispatch center, spread by a single text message from a stunned police officer to his wife, and then it exploded. Within an hour, the park was surrounded by news vans, their satellite dishes piercing the sky. Reporters shouted questions over the police tape that had been hastily strung up, creating a chaotic wall of sound and light. The world, which had forgotten, was suddenly remembering with a ferocious, hungry intensity. Across town, the phone rang in the quiet, darkened living room of Mark and Sarah Miller. They were sitting in silence, as they did every year on this day, lost in their own private grief. The jarring sound made them both jump. Mark looked at the caller ID. It was an unknown number from their old area code. His first instinct was to ignore it, probably a telemarketer or another cruel wrong number. But something, a faint, impossible flicker of something, made him pick it up. "Hello." The voice on the other end was official, trembling slightly. "Mr. Miller? This is Chief Edwards from the Clearwater Police Department." Mark's heart clenched. The chief had retired years ago. Why was he calling? Had they found something? A bone? A scrap of clothing? He braced himself for the final, terrible confirmation. "Mark," the chief said, and his voice broke. "Mark, you need to sit down. You and Sarah. You need to get in your car and drive to Clearwater Memorial Hospital right now." "What is it?" Mark asked, his own voice a dry rasp. "What have you found?" "It's not what, Mark. It's who." "They're alive. They're all alive. They're at the hospital. They're waiting for you." The line went dead. Mark Miller stood frozen, the phone clutched in his hand, the chief's words echoing in the silent room. Too monumental, too impossible to process. He looked at his wife, her face a question mark of fear and hope. "Sarah," he whispered, the word barely audible. He said they're alive." A similar scene was unfolding at the Vance household. David Vance answered the phone to the same unbelievable message. He dropped the receiver. It clattered to the floor, and he simply stared at his wife, Helen, his face as white as a sheet. For 7 years, they had prayed for a miracle, and now that it was here, their minds refused to accept it. It was too vast, too world-shattering. They moved like automatons, grabbing car keys, fumbling with locks, their hearts pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against their ribs. The drive to the hospital was a blur. They didn't speak. What could they say? The hope was too terrifying to give voice to, a fragile soap bubble that could pop with the slightest touch. When they arrived, the hospital was in a state of controlled chaos. Police barricades held back a growing crowd of reporters and onlookers. An officer recognized them and quickly ushered them through a side entrance, away from the prying cameras. They were led to a private wing, to a quiet hallway where Chief Edwards, now older and grayer, stood waiting, his face a complex map of awe and anxiety. "They're in there," he said softly, pointing to a door. "The doctors are with them. They're physically fine. But Mark, Sarah, David, Helen, you have to prepare yourselves. They haven't changed. Not at all." The parents pushed the door open. The room was bright, sterile, and there, sitting on 3 hospital beds, were their children. Leo, Chloe, Emily. They were wearing hospital gowns now, but their faces, their hair, their eyes, they were exactly as they had been on that afternoon 7 years ago. It was like looking through a window into the past. For a long, breathless moment, there was only silence. Then Chloe, her small voice cutting through the shock, said, "Mommy? Daddy? What took you so long? The park man found us." The sound of her voice, unchanged, unharmed, broke the dam. Sarah Miller let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, and rushed forward, collapsing at Chloe's bedside and gathering her into her arms, weeping uncontrollably. Mark stood behind her, his hand on Leo's shoulder, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking. Across the room, David and Helen Vance enveloped Emily in a desperate, trembling hug, holding her as if she might dissolve into smoke. But amid the overwhelming joy and relief, a cold undercurrent of unease began to flow. The children accepted the hugs, but they were passive, confused. They didn't understand the tears, the intensity of the emotion. To them, only minutes had passed. Leo looked at his father, his young brow furrowed. "Dad, why is everyone crying? And why are we at the doctor? I'm not sick." He looked around the strange, white room. "Where are the burgers? You said they were almost ready." The questions were innocent, mundane, and they landed with the force of a physical blow. The parents pulled back slightly, staring into the faces of their children, who were impossibly still living in the bright, sunny afternoon of May 18th, 7 years in the past. The miracle was real, but it was also deeply, profoundly wrong. The joy was instantly tempered by a new, chilling mystery. Where had they been? And why hadn't a single second of time touched them? The hospital room, once a place of sterile silence, was now a crucible of overwhelming and conflicting emotions. The initial, explosive joy of the parents began to slowly cool, hardening into a shell of profound confusion and a dawning, icy fear. They were holding their children, their babies, feeling the solid, warm reality of them, smelling the familiar scent of their hair. Yet, every sense was screaming that this was impossible. The doctors, moving with a hushed, reverent caution, began their examinations. They drew blood, checked reflexes, scanned their small bodies with machines that hummed and clicked, trying to find a scientific foothold in a reality that had none. The results, when they came, were as baffling as the children's return. Physiologically, Leo, Chloe, and Emily were perfectly healthy 8, 6, and 10-year-olds. There were no signs of malnutrition, no scars, no evidence of trauma or injury. Their blood work was normal. Their teeth showed no new growth. Their baby teeth were still in place, with no adult teeth waiting beneath the gums. It was as if their biological clocks had been paused, frozen at the exact moment they vanished from the picnic blanket. The lead physician, a woman named Dr. Evans with decades of experience, could only shake her head in bewilderment. "Medically, there is no explanation for this," she told the parents, her voice low and earnest. "It contradicts every known law of human development. They haven't aged a single day." The parents clung to this miracle, but the children's behavior made it impossible to simply celebrate. They were disoriented and frightened by the hospital, by the strange devices, by the adults who wept and stared at them with a frightening intensity. They asked simple, heartbreaking questions. "Why is your hair gray now, Daddy?" Leo asked Mark Miller, touching a strand of his father's hair that had turned silver in the long years of grief. "Why is Mommy so old?" The questions were innocent, but they were daggers, reminding everyone of the 7-year chasm that the children had not lived through. The police attempted gentle questioning, hoping for a clue to break the case wide open. Detective Maria Flores, who had been a rookie during the original investigation, sat with Emily Vance, speaking in the softest tones. "Emily, can you tell me what happened after you were playing tag? After your dad called you for lunch?" Emily's eyes grew distant, a faint frown on her face. "The lady told us to come and see the flowers," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Detective Flores leaned forward, her pulse quickening. This was the first new piece of information in 7 years. "What lady, sweetheart?" "The pretty lady," Chloe piped up from a next bed, overhearing. "She had a yellow dress. She said she had a secret garden with the best flowers, right behind the big tree." Leo nodded, his expression serious. "We only went for a minute. We were going to come right back for the burgers." "The flowers were all white," Emily continued, her gaze fixed on a point on the wall that wasn't there. "And they chimed, like little bells. It was pretty." She then shivered, a sudden, involuntary tremor that ran through her small body. "But then the light was wrong." "What do you mean, the light was wrong?" Flores asked gently. "It was sunny, but then it got dark. Not like night. Like the sun was broken. And the lady, she wasn't pretty anymore. Her smile was too big." Emily's voice dropped even further. She said we had to be quiet. We had to play a new game. A sleeping game. The children could offer no more than these fragments. Their story was a jumble of childish impressions. A pretty lady, chiming flowers, a sudden darkness, and a game they didn't want to play. They had no concept of days or years passing. For them, the entire experience was a confusing blur that had lasted only a few minutes, ending with them sitting on a park bench, wondering why their parents were taking so long with lunch. The pretty lady was a ghost in the story, a vague figure with no identifiable features beyond a yellow dress. There were no descriptions of a vehicle, a hideout, or any other accomplices. The investigation, which had roared back to life with the force of a hurricane, hit this new, surreal wall installed. How do you investigate a secret garden with chiming flowers? The families eventually returned home, but there was no return in normalcy. The world watched them, a global audience captivated by the impossible. Their houses were surrounded by cameras day and night. News shows debated theories endlessly, from advanced scientific experiments to divine intervention. The parents, meanwhile, faced a challenge no one had ever faced before: raising children who were 7 years out of time. Leo, at 8, should have been starting high school. Instead, he was struggling to understand what a smartphone was. Emily, who should have been learning to drive, was bewildered by the new version of her old favorite cartoon. Chloe's best friends were now teenagers who didn't know how to relate to a 6-year-old trapped in a 13-year-old's world. The emotional toll was immense. The parents were terrified to let the children out of their sight. Every shadow, every strange car, every unexpected noise sent them into a panic. They had gotten their miracle, but it had come wrapped in a deep, unsettling mystery that offered no peace. They lived in a state of constant, low-grade fear, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the pretty lady to return, for the world to break again. One evening, months after their return, Mark Miller was tucking Leo into bed. The boy had been quiet all day, staring out the window at the backyard. "Dad," he said, as Mark turned off the light. "Did we do a bad thing?" Mark's heart ached. "No, son. Of course not. Why would you think that?" "Because the lady said we were special. She said we were chosen to be quiet and still, to make things right." Leo's voice was sleepy, his words slurring. "She said the world is too loud. It breaks things. We were supposed to help fix it by being quiet." It was the most coherent thing any of the children had said about their experience. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, his blood running cold. Fix what, Leo? What was broken? But Leo was already asleep, slipping away into dreams that his father could not follow. Mark sat there in the dark for a long time, watching his son sleep. He looked so peaceful, so ordinary. Yet, he carried a secret inside him, a memory of 7 lost years that felt like minutes, of a pretty lady and chiming flowers and a darkness that broke the sun. The official case would remain open, but the clues had led nowhere. The only evidence was the word of 3 children who had not aged, who spoke of things that could not be real. The mystery of the Clearwater vanishing was never solved. There were no arrests, no grand revelations. The children, over time, slowly began to adapt to their new old world, but a part of them always remained distant, a little detached, as if a piece of their consciousness was still sitting on that bench, waiting for a lunch that would never come. The parents learned to live with the unanswered questions, to embrace the miracle without understanding its cost. They had their children back, and for that, they were eternally grateful. But the shadow of the pretty lady and the silence of those 7 years would forever hang over their lives, a permanent, silent reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed, and that the world holds mysteries far stranger and more terrifying than anyone can ever know. The picnic spot in Clearwater Park remains quiet, and to this day, parents watch their children play there with a little more care, a little more fear, glancing sometimes towards the treeline, wondering what else might be waiting just out of sight in the spaces between the seconds. The years that followed were a delicate, often painful, balancing act. The media storm eventually subsided, though it never fully died. The families moved to a remote property in the country, seeking a solitude that the world was reluctant to grant them. They became experts in evasion, constructing a life behind high fences and privacy hedges, their existence a carefully guarded secret. The children were homeschooled, their contact with the outside world limited and intensely supervised. They were like rare, fragile plants, kept in a greenhouse to protect them from a climate they were not equipped to survive. Leo, Chloe, and Emily grew, but it was a growth that felt observed, as if everyone was waiting for some delayed reaction to finally manifest. They learned new things, adapted to new technology, but their emotional development seemed out of sync. They had moments of startling maturity, often followed by episodes of bewildering childishness. They could discuss the physics of a smartphone with keen interest, yet would become paralyzed with fear during a thunderstorm, hiding under their beds as if expecting the world to break apart again. The parents noticed the small things, the details that kept the mystery alive and terrifying. Chloe developed an intense, inexplicable fear of the color yellow. If a visitor arrived in a yellow coat or a delivery truck of that color passed by the gate, she would retreat into a catatonic silence for hours, her eyes wide and unseeing. Leo began sleepwalking. They would find him in the backyard, standing perfectly still in the middle of the lawn, facing the woods that bordered their property. When gently led back to bed, he would have no memory of it in the morning. He once murmured in his sleep, "The bells are ringing. It's time to be quiet." Emily was the most changed. The vibrant, outgoing 10-year-old was gone, replaced by a quiet, observant girl who seemed to carry a great weight on her slender shoulders. She rarely laughed. She would often be found simply staring at things. A dripping faucet, a line of ants, the pattern of frost on a window pane, with an intensity that was unsettling. She seemed to be searching for something hidden within the ordinary fabric of the world. One afternoon, Sarah Miller was cleaning Emily's room when she found a drawing tucked under the mattress. It was done in crayon on a large sheet of paper. In the center was a stick figure of a woman in a bright yellow dress, her smile a wide, red slash that took up half her face. Around her were 3 smaller figures, 2 boys and a girl. Above them, the sun was drawn not as a yellow circle, but as a black scribble, with jagged lines radiating from it like broken spokes. And all around the figures, covering the entire bottom of the page, were hundreds of small, white, bell-shaped flowers. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the drawing. It was a child's rendition of a nightmare, a direct window into the fragmented memory they had tried so hard to access. She showed it to Mark that night, and they sat at the kitchen table, staring at the crude, terrifying image, feeling the old fear wash over them anew. They never spoke of it to Emily. They were too afraid of what it might trigger. The official investigation remained open but inactive. The lead detective, Maria Flores, would call once a year on the anniversary, a somber check-in that was more about personal closure than professional duty. The file on the pretty lady and the chiming flowers had led nowhere. There were no women in yellow dresses reported in the area that day, no florists selling unusual white bellflowers, no hypnosis sessions with the children that yielded any clear details. The case was a monument to the unknowable. As the children entered their teenage years, the gap between their physical age and their lived experience created a unique kind of isolation. They understood, intellectually, that 7 years had passed, but they felt no connection to those years. History lessons about events that happened during their absence felt like science fiction. Music from that time held no nostalgia. They were aliens in their own timeline, and this shared, profound dislocation bound them together in a way that no one else, not even their parents, could truly penetrate. They developed their own quiet language, a series of looks and subtle gestures, often retreating into a shared silence that was comfortable for them, but deeply unnerving for everyone else. The parents learned to live with a new kind of fear. It was not the sharp, agonizing pain of loss they had known for 7 years, but a constant, low hum of anxiety. They had their children back, but they were guarding a precious, impossible secret. They watched for any sign of the strange darkness the children had described, for any woman who looked too long at their family, for anything that seemed out of place in their carefully controlled world. The miracle of their return was forever tainted by the terrifying unknown of where they had been. The joy was real, but it was a joy that was always held hostage by fear. The story of the Clearwater Three faded from the front pages, but it never disappeared. It became a modern legend, a ghost story for the digital age, a permanent reminder that the map of reality still has edges marked "Here be dragons." And in a quiet house in the country, 3 children who were now teenagers, and the parents who had grown old waiting for them, continued their lives together, a family woven back together by a thread of miracle and mystery. They lived with the unanswerable questions, learning to find happiness in the moments between the fear, always watching, always waiting, forever haunted by the memory of chiming flowers and a silence that lasted for 7 years. The truth was out there, but it remained hidden, a secret kept by time itself, and by 3 children who had played a sleeping game in a garden that no one else could ever find.